When we enter triangle pose, trikonasana, should we first shift our hips back and reach our rib cage forward and maybe reach like this arm out long? Should we do all of that first and then come down into the pose? Or is it okay to just come into triangle pose without doing that? So this is a really good question. And I find that people actually ask me about this a lot when it comes to questions about triangle pose specifically. And I think that this is easily confusing because we tend to see that little hip bump and the rib cage shift. We tend to see that taught fairly frequently out there. And sometimes people are led to believe that that is the way to practice triangle pose. And that if we don't like kind of prepare the movement or set up by doing this first, like if we don't do that, then we will end up in an incorrect triangle pose or a non-optimal triangle pose, things like that. So these ideas that like that hip shift is important and we should do it. So the question is the hip shift important? And should we shift to the side before we come down? And if so, and if not, why? Like what's up anatomically and biomechanically with this whole hip shift to begin with? So in this video, I would like to present my movement science-based take on this good triangle pose question. And I'll start by just giving a quick nutshell response as far as what I think about this hip shift, which is that no, I don't think that it's important that we go out of our way to intentionally do this before we lower down. I don't think that it's a bad thing to do at all. I think it could be just fine to do. But basically this hip shift is a lateral tilting of the pelvis that's happening in the frontal plane of movement. And it's something that's going to happen in triangle pose anyway, whether we go out of our way to do it at first before we come down, like whether we kind of break up the order and do this and then lower, or whether we just come into the pose. Either way, this pelvic lateral shift is going to be happening. So I don't think it's important that we pull it out and that we teach it as the only way to enter triangle, and that if you don't do that, you're somehow in an incorrect triangle. I would not agree with that. But like I said, I do think it could be just fine to teach, and it can be helpful in certain ways. This lateral tilting of the pelvis, which is what this is anatomically, this pelvic lateral tilt, is something that's going to happen in triangle pose anyway, whether we intentionally like go out of our way to isolate it and do it in the beginning or not. Either way, the pelvis is going to laterally tilt. So that movement of pelvic lateral tilt, this is a movement that takes place in the frontal plane. And those are movements that we would see if we were looking at the body straight from the front or from the back. All these kinds of movements are all frontal plane movements. And so is this when we do this like lateral tilting of the pelvis. So that lateral tilt of the pelvis, when we're like kind of up here ready to go down into triangle, when we do this, that's what's happening. And this movement of the pelvis will affect our hip joints because the pelvis is through the hip joint connected to the thigh, and that movement of the pelvis will change how our hips are positioned. So when we laterally tilt the pelvis like this, what this does is it will move our back hip. So this is like my back leg. Now I'm coming into triangle this way. This will move my back hip into some adduction, hip adduction, like this direction of movement. It's moving in that direction. And then we are moving this front hip into more abduction. So abduction was this, like thigh away from midline. So in this like top position of triangle, when we tilt the pelvis, we're adducting the back hip and we're abducting the front hip. That's what's happening. So we're kind of isolating that frontal plane hip movement by doing that kind of pre-bump of the hips back. So that's like what's happening anatomically. But like I said, when we like move in the frontal plane to come down in a triangle, that movement is going to happen anyway. So here is one of the main reason that I think that this hip adjustment is often taught has to do with spinal alignment in triangle pose. So you might be familiar with like these kind of values that are placed on triangle, or ideals on triangle pose sometimes, that when we're in triangle, we should keep both side waists like even, and we should not let our bottom side waist get short and the top side waist get long. So sometimes, like, you might hear in triangle pose, you might hear cues to like lengthen the bottom side waist so that it's like the same length as the top side waist, something like that. And that's because sometimes there are ideals placed on triangle where we don't want to shorten the bottom side waist. So what's up with that? What is shortening the bottom side waist and what's lengthening the top side waist? So what that movement basically is spinal lateral flexion or a spinal side bend. And once again, this is movement in the frontal plane. When we side bend, that's frontal plane movement. So sometimes there are ideals placed on triangle pose in which the intention behind the pose is to just isolate lower body movement basically, and to not let the spine also move. So in that case, if that was one's intention in teaching or practicing triangle, then they would want to keep the spine neutral, and as you come forward, only move at this hip. So as you come forward, that's hip flexion. So kind of only moving there and not letting the spine flex. So this spinal lateral flexion will often happen if someone comes into triangle pose and they run out of hip range of motion at the hip, and then they keep wanting to come, like maybe they're reaching for the floor. So if you run out of room at the hip to move, but you keep moving, what will happen is that you will laterally flex your spine. That's like where the movement has to come from, and you end up side bending. So that's the thing that often yoga teachers are trying to avoid or like kind of control against, is that lateral flexion happening. Now, from my perspective and from my understanding of like movement science and the body, I don't personally think it's a big deal if we laterally flex the spine a bit in triangle or not. That's not something that I would go out of my way to like nitpick around, unless I had like a really specific reason to, or maybe in one particular class, I had a certain theme, and then kind of controlling hip and spinal movement that way was relevant for that theme. Then I might try to control that and cue around that. But in general, I don't worry about it too much. I'm more just about triangle poses, like mobilizing the lower body. We're gonna mobilize the lower body, whether the spine stays completely neutral or whether we add a little bit of spinal lateral flexion. That's not really gonna change the lower body, so I don't tend to nitpick it. But sometimes that is an ideal placed on triangle. And that could be based on aesthetics. It could be like wanting triangle pose to look a certain way because maybe that's how it looks in yoga books. Or maybe it's because when someone is teaching triangle, they really, really just want to isolate the movement to the hip. So isolate hip movement and don't let the spine also move. That's another reason why we might emphasize that. So bringing all of that back to this like hip shift question. So I talked about how when we laterally tilt the pelvis, when we do that hip bump, that's going to affect movement at the hip joints. But the pelvis is also connected to the spine. And so when the pelvis moves, the spine will also move. So what this pelvic lateral tilt does is it not only will like adduct, abduct at the hip joints, but it will also laterally flex the spine. That's like the coupled movement that happens there. So if we're down in triangle pose, and if a yoga teacher cues to lengthen the bottom side waist, which again, that's that cue to try to come out of spinal lateral flexion and, come back to neutral. If that cue is offered, and if we go out of our way to try to do that, that is mainly coming from pulling the front hip back or this lateral tilt of the pelvis. It's basically this happening, but down here in the pose, this happens. And the pelvis pulling down that way will lengthen the side waist. It will bring us out of a little, like if we were in a little bit of a side bend. So that's like what the cue is suggesting anatomically. We may not say that, like it's not that we're in triangle and a yoga teacher says, laterally tilt your pelvis like in this direction, but our teacher might say lengthen the side waist. And that's effectively what's happening anatomical position wise, is that the pelvis moves. We also could reach the rib cage forward. There's that as well. So those kind of the rib cage and the pelvis move, and they lengthen out down there. So bringing all of that back, that's like how the pelvis can move relative to the rib cage and change spinal alignment, and why a cue like lengthen the bottom side waist ties into bumping the hips back, because it helps create that like quote ideal that sometimes is placed on triangle pose, that the spine stays neutral. So bringing that back to whether it's important to find the hip shift before we enter triangle or not. Once again, I'll just say again, I don't think it's important that we do this ahead of time. But if you do this ahead of time, what this will do by laterally tilting the pelvis here is you will kind of pre-lengthen this bottom side waist. You will kind of pre-control for not coming into spinal lateral flexion or just minimizing that as you come down. So this bump back can kind of help encourage us to try to keep that bottom side waist long as we come down. And so that might be a reason to teach that or practice that or play with that in your practice. If it's your intention in the moment with triangle to really only move at the hips and the lower body and to keep the spine out of it, if that's like important to you, then it might just help increase your awareness to kind of pull out and isolate the pelvic tilt beforehand, like find that and then try to keep that as you lower down. That might be a good reason to play with it. But like I said, I don't think it's important that we do that ahead of time, because we can also do that same action down in the pose. So you could be in triangle pose. Maybe I'll do it on this side, and maybe I'll bring in a block because this is my personal favorite way to be in triangle. But when you're in triangle pose, you can laterally tilt the pelvis from being down here, and you can create that like lengthened bottom side waist and kind of shorten up here so that you kind of try to more embody that ideal of the more neutral spine. So it's completely possible to move your pelvis when you're down here. We don't have to start up here and then move the pelvis and then hold the pelvis and then come down, because we could do it down there. So I hope that I presented a nuanced take on this. There could be reasons that we might want to do so, but I also don't think it's important. And you kind of could even take a step back and just wonder about spinal position and triangle pose, and how important is that to you, and how important is isolating hip movement to begin with? Like, what's your intention for the pose? What are we trying to get? What's our target in the pose? And once we're clear on those intentions, then the way that we cue also becomes just more clear and more like second nature. If you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so that you could stay up to date with all of the tips that I share.